I don't think so.
Okay, so it's about 7:31.
He's asked the group to say, hey, can that happen?
There's a little bit of background noise in someone's household. We may need to put.
So there's a solution. We need a solution. Carly, you resigned from the board.
Thank you very much for taking care of the mute. That is a great segue for tonight. First of all, I want to say thank you everyone for joining us. This is week 2 of the Ladies Be Architects Apex 16 study group. And I am going to give a little bit of an overview of what we have in store for tonight. So week 2, we actually have a special presentation by Susannah Kate. She is going to cover some of the material from her test-driven development for the rest of us. So I'll introduce Susannah in just a minute. We're also going to cover a little bit of our topics from last week. So we'll be covering Intro to Apex, and then we'll be talking about some basic syntax triggers and test classes. And then we'll go through some of the homework and see what questions you have. So with that, I do want to let folks know I may mute myself a little bit because you may hear baby Blazer is in the background. He's up past his bedtime, so I may mute for a little bit. But that's what we have in store for tonight. And I want to say thank you to Susannah Kate for joining us. For those of you who aren't already familiar with Susannah, she is the newest co-leader of Ladies Be Architects. She's really, really well known in the Salesforce ecosystem. She is a Salesforce architect over at Boston Scientific. She's also a rad women code coach. And she's here to join us tonight. So thank you so much, Susannah.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you, Blanca. I am very happy to be joining you guys tonight. I'm just going to go ahead and get my screen share going. And yeah, so thanks so much, Blanca, for, first of all, leading this group. I know that so many folks have come up to me and said how much they appreciate all the work that you're doing on your journey to PD1. So this is awesome that I get to.
Well, there's a little bit of feedback. Does anyone else hear that? On the line?
Yeah, Blanca, I hear it too.
Yeah, so even I don't hear properly.
Susannah?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you very clearly.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. Would you mind stopping your share and then I'll go ahead and share my screen?
Yes.
Awesome, cool. But I was just saying thanks for having me, if that wasn't audible, but I'm very excited to be joining you guys. This is a presentation that I did at Northeast Dreamin a couple of weeks ago, and I think it is probably a really good segue into some of the topics that you guys are going to be talking about tonight. So, and stop me or send a chat if my audio goes out again. Sorry about that. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, Susannah.
Yes, Susannah.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. So, like Blanca said, my name is Susannah StGermain, and I'm a technical architect at Boston Scientific, based out in Boston, Massachusetts. And I am super thrilled to be talking about this topic. It's something that is pretty near and dear to my heart, because I think a lot of times when folks are learning Apex test classes and learning how to cover their code is usually sort of an afterthought. It's, you know, you learn the syntax and then you're like, oh yeah, I need to learn how to cover my code so I can deploy it, you know, to production or up to a different environment. And especially when I started learning how to code, the idea of test coverage and writing test classes was always a bit confusing, especially because I feel like it was always crammed into like the last segment of a coding class. So this is sort of an opportunity to flip that on its head and start to learn about test-driven development for no matter where you are in your coding journey. So even if you're, an expert developer or someone starting out on their journey to learning how to write Apex, I think we can learn different bits and pieces about how to write and learn how to write better code by taking some lessons from TDD. So to get started, let's make sure we're all on the same page as far as, what the heck is test-driven development anyway. So at its core, this is like a really classical definition of test-driven development. It's a software development process, and it relies on a couple things. The first being a really short development cycle. On a short development cycle where you're looking at a business requirement, turning it into a very specific test case, and then writing your code, your actual business logic Apex, so that your code helps you pass those tests. And, for some people, for people that are used to maybe writing code or working maybe in a more classical software development background, this definition might make total sense. But for the rest of us, this is us when we look at that crazy definition, right? Like, how does that help me write better code? How does that help me learn how to write Apex to begin with? So today we're going to actually break down that big definition into more digestible chunks and learn how we can start to apply some of those processes and methodologies as beginning developers. So to get started, that definition with a fair amount of, I think, maybe confusing words, can be broken down into really 4 basic steps. So test-driven development, the whole point of it is that you write your tests first. So we go over this continuum essentially where we first write our tests before you do anything else. We run our test next before we write any other code. Then we make a little change into our actual Apex that you guys have probably started to learn how to write. And then we run the test again. And we repeat that cycle over and over until we have code that makes all of our tests pass. I'm just going to take a peek at the chat just to make sure that there's not any audio issues. Let's see.
No audio issues, and I was saying that considering we're only in week 2 of this week course, I feel like pulling my hair out already. We haven't even got to the unit testing.
Exactly, yeah. So it's like a little bit of an untraditional way to start to talk about code, but hopefully you guys are going to learn a framework that once you go through a lot of the rest of this course, I think you guys will be able to sort of put these 2 pieces together and start off on your Apex journey just writing better code than if you sort of approach this at the end.
Yes,
so
like David Lou said, we're going to learn how to love how to test, and we're just creating, good habits right off the bat.
Exactly. So the 4 bubbles we looked at just a second ago. So we write our test, we run the test, we write some code, and then we run the test again. Really the meat of the work that's going to happen in this TDD paradigm is in writing the test. And that learning how to do that first, actually, I think is pretty cool. And it sets you up to be, like you were saying, Blanca, better developers. And essentially, if you write a test, what you're doing is 3 basic things. You're arranging data, you're acting on that and performing the action that you want to test, and then you're asserting that what you want to happen actually happened. And let's actually take a step back and think about how that applies to a real life scenario or real life coding problem. So the entire idea of writing a test revolves around a business requirement, usually. That's how you know what to write in your test. So tonight, our business requirement is going to be that we have our Salesforce instance. Maybe one of our sales reps come to us and say, anytime a new prospect account is created in Salesforce, automatically I want a case to be created with that account so that I can remember to send that new prospect account an Astro plushie. Of course, there are multiple ways to do this, right? We can do it with code. We could do it with like a declarative tool like Process Builder. But for our case, we're going to learn how to do this sort of simple automation using Apex. So to get started, when we write our test, like I was saying before, we have to arrange and set up the test data that we want to work with.
Susannah? Susannah?
Hey, can you hear me, Blanca?
Yes, now we can hear you. We could hear, but it sounded like a robot, like the chat window.
Okay. Any better?
Yeah. What I did
Okay.
catch last was the beginning of the scenario where you were talking about we have a case.
Okay, cool. So our entire process of writing our tests, like writing a new Apex test, is based on what the business requirement is that we're given, right? So for our class tonight, our requirement is that whenever a new prospect account is inserted, a case should be created automatically and associated to that account so that a sales rep can remember to send an Astro plushie to that new account. And we can do it multiple ways, right? We could do this declaratively, but for our exercise, we're going to be learning how to write a test to cover this in Apex. So to get started, since we're working with accounts, we would need to build some test accounts in our code. We would then want to perform the action that we want to test. And in our case, the action that we want to test is actually inserting that account. So inserting that prospect account. And then the outcome that we want our code to do, the actual action that we want our code to perform, is to create a case and associate that case to an account. So those are the three things that we're going to be doing within the test section. And we'll look at some code shortly, but just to get the overarching sort of process of test-driven development. First, we write the test. Then we run the test. And if anyone's done this before, surprise, surprise, what's going to happen is our test is going to fail. And that's good. That means a couple of things. Number one, that means that the test that we've written and the framework we're using is actually testing something. Like if we wrote our test first and they passed, and that happens sometimes. If you've ever seen some of your developers' code or heard about, maybe code coverage being 75% or more, but it's not actually testing business scenarios, you can write tests that don't actually do anything. But the way you know that your tests are actually working is if you write them first, you run them before you've done anything else, and then you've seen how they fail, you've seen the information that failure will give back to you, and we'll look at an example of that. This is how you're going to know what next step you need to do and what areas of your code that you need to improve once you build out this testing framework. And I also think it's kind of nice. It's kind of empowering. Like you don't need to worry about like, oh, is my code right? Am I doing the right things? Like you set up this testing framework and you run it and it fails, and that's what you want. You want to see those failures, and then you get to work chunk by chunk in resolving those failures and writing better code. So the next step is starting to write your code so that some of those failures one by one can be resolved. So the first thing that we do is think back to our requirements, right? So we've written our test. what kind of business logic, what kind of code do we actually need to write in order to meet the requirement of, after a prospect account is inserted, create a case and associate it to that account. And again, I know you guys probably haven't covered a lot of this, but I think thinking through some of the things we're going to cover tonight, probably after I hop off, might make a little more sense. But to meet these two requirements, we're going to write a couple of different types of code. The first type is a trigger. So we're going to write a piece of code that listens for that prospect account being inserted or an account being inserted. And then we're going to write another chunk of code that actually does the business logic. So that actually creates a case that's associated to the account. And then we're going to finally use another flavor of code to insert that case that we create. So those are sort of the three pieces of code that we need to create in order to start to see some of our test failures pass. And then finally, what we'll see, we run the test again. We run our tests early and often as we make tiny little improvements so that we know that we're not, number one, writing code that isn't doing what we want it to do, that we're writing code that actually resolves the requirement that we're trying to solve for. And sort of the gist of test-driven development is that you shouldn't be writing more code than you need to. Like you shouldn't be writing, tons and tons of stuff, then, spend like 5 hours on it and try to insert an account and see that nothing's happening. Like we want to make sure that you're writing this testing framework, then writing a little bit of code and seeing, how that code has changed some of the errors that you're getting back. So now this has all been pretty like theoretical and a lot, and for some of you guys who are just starting out, probably a little bit of maybe not so concrete. So let's actually take a look at some code in a sandbox and start to see what some of these frameworks look like. So I'm going to hop out of my slides and go into a sandbox that I've spun up. And we'll start to look at a base, well, I don't know if I would say basic, but a pretty common testing framework that that folks use over and over and over in order to make sure that the code they're writing is performing in a way that will allow for a number of different things to happen. And we'll look at those different things that we're sort of testing for, and that as you start to write more code, you can ensure that you're testing every time. Because that's one of the nice things of writing tests first, especially as you're starting out. Like, this looks like a lot of code, for sure. But the nice part about writing your test first is that you can use the same pattern over and over, because the things that you're testing for aren't necessarily going to change. The complicated part truly is that business logic, because you're going to be writing different code every time, right, for different problems. But you can set up a handful of tests that you run every single time you're writing new code to ensure that that code you're writing is like scalable, is actually doing what you want, et cetera, et cetera. So let's actually run down this sort of crazy looking test class. I'll try to break down sort of the different bits, and then we'll write a couple of lines of Apex that are probably more along the lines of what you guys will be doing the rest of class. So to get started, this is a test class, and it'll have a couple of different features that will look different than some of the other code. Yep.
I'm sorry,
Blanca?
I think we're still looking at the slide deck.
You are. Let's see. Let's stop sharing. I'm going to reshare. I'm not sure why you guys are seeing the slide deck. Let's try this. How about now?
Yes, now we can see developer console.
Awesome. Awesome. So yes, this is our developer console, and what is on the screen and what we're going to walk through are some basic framework tests that you can replicate in as you start to learn how to write different triggers and different classes. And essentially what you're looking at right now is like a lot of those classes that you're going to be writing. You'll notice a couple of different things though. So starting on line 1, you can see that there's this @is_test notation. And this is notation that you'll have at the beginning of every single test class that you write. That's how the system knows that what it's looking at is a test and isn't code that it is going to try to execute like normal Apex. So after this @is_test notation, the rest of the code looks pretty similar to a normal class. So just one note is that tests have this notation at the beginning, and they're also private. So all your test classes that you'll see will be private. That's instead of public, like some of the other test classes that classes that you'll be writing. And then inside these curly braces is where the different test methods and different variables and pieces of code start to come together. So we have our private test class called account trigger handler test. That's just the name of the class. And going down here, we're starting to actually dive into that sort of 3-pronged formula that we looked at in the slides. So the process of arranging test data. On line 5, there's this integer variable that we've declared that essentially is saying, hey, there's an integer that we're calling test size. And right now we're assigning a value of 5 to this particular integer. So we're going to use this later on in our code, but right now it's just up here so that we can use this public variable in all the different bits of our code later on. But going down into the meat of this arrange, this setting up your test data is something that you're going to do anytime you write test code. So even if you didn't know what you were trying to test, you could go ahead and set up this section every time. Another piece of notation that's really quite powerful is this @test_setup notation tells the platform that this particular chunk of code starting here, right? Because this is our method that we're creating. But this notation on line 8 tells Salesforce that this chunk of code, line 10 down to 16, should run before everything else every single time that we run this test class. So this is powerful for a couple of reasons, but mostly because we don't want to have to build this account or these accounts that we're going to test with every single time we want to test something. We could, but that would be writing out like 5 lines of code every single time we're trying to test something. So this sort of saves us a little bit of time. It says, hey, we're creating these accounts to use in our test class, and just make sure that that exists before I do anything else. It's also a good segue to the fact that the reason why we need to arrange our test data in the first place is because our test class, unless we do something super, super naughty, which we shouldn't do, which is telling the system that our test class can see all data, unless we put that setting on the test class, which we should almost never do, this test class can't see any of the data inside of your Salesforce instance. So if we were to not do this test up, but say, hey, print out or tell me how many accounts exist in our Salesforce instance, this test class would be blind to the fact that maybe we have some other accounts, maybe we have some other data. So that's really the importance of arranging the data. So scrolling down a little bit, this is where, so in our test setup, this is where we start to build some accounts. And the important piece again of what's happening here, a lot of this is maybe a little bit much for your second class, but what we're doing is creating a list of accounts, and we're taking and saying, hey, make however many number of accounts that we set up here on line 5. So we're essentially building 5 accounts of type prospect, because our business scenario said, hey, create cases for prospect accounts only. So that's what this section is doing. And then moving on to sort of the next prong of setting up the test is we're going to actually act. We're going to do something with our test data that we just set up. And we're going to use what's called DML, or data manipulation language. And we're going to put the accounts that we just created into the Salesforce database. So that's what's happening on line 20. And this whole chunk of code, line 10 to 22, is essentially just setting up our data and then inserting it into the database so that we can work with it later on in our test methods. So going down a little farther. So one of the premises, and you'll probably cover, Blanca, maybe later on in class, is, what should you actually test for? Like, why are we writing these tests? What are the things that you should be testing for? And as a best practice, there are a couple of different types of tests that you want to always run. One of them, which I kind of like, is this idea of running like a sanity check test. This is a test that should always pass. And what we're doing in this sanity check test is we're saying, hey, make sure, and just to break this one down, because this is the first test we've actually looked at, we set up our data, we acted and we inserted our accounts, and now we want to verify that what we expect to happen has actually happened. And in this case, all we're expecting to happen is that the accounts were created. And because we're using Salesforce, because it has all of this, functionality built in, this is truly just a sanity check. Like, the account, if I create an account, as long as I fill out all the required fields, like, that account should be created. And there shouldn't be any question as to whether or not I wrote custom code to insert that account. It should always be created. So when we assert and verify the result, what we're doing is we're querying the database. So we're saying, hey, select an ID in this case. We could select multiple fields, but we're saying, hey, select the records that have been inserted into the database from our account table and put them into this bucket, this list. And then this is really the unique piece of Apex testing, this line 33, where we're saying, hey, I want to verify that I expect to have 5 accounts come back. If we think back to that test size variable that we set up at the first line, I expect this to be equal to the size of my list. So essentially we're saying, I told you to insert 5 accounts. I expect for 5 accounts to have been inserted. And that's what this system.assert equals does. It takes what I expect, and then there's a comma. That's just the syntax. It says, this is what I expect, and this is what actually happened. And then this system.assert equals says that the thing before the comma should equal the thing after the comma. That's a pretty basic, not basic, but that's a pretty standard setup for an Apex test. And I'll just run kind of quickly through the other ones, just because I want you guys to feel like you should understand every single bit of the syntax here, but we're essentially just verifying a positive result. We expect, if I tell the system to insert 5 accounts, that I expect for 5 accounts to be created. And we're doing a similar thing down here with our case. You wouldn't want your test failing because your test data didn't match a validation rule or something else caught. Yes, that's a really good point, Mark. So there's actually tests. So, right, we do positive tests, and we'll see a positive case insert as well. So, or a positive case test. So essentially we're saying, hey, go into the database and search for the cases that have been created by my Apex code that I'm writing and by the test accounts I've inserted. And then let's do another assert. Let's say, okay, I told the system to insert 5 accounts, and if I've written my code right, I expect for 5 prospect accounts to equate to 5 cases. And so this is sort of my positive, right? Like in a perfect world, if everything was right, if I didn't hit a validation rule or something like that, I expect for 5 account inserts to equal 5 new cases. And then we're doing a couple more fancy things, and we're saying, well, I also expect for a case to have been created for each account, right? Because we don't expect that one account had 5 cases created for it. We expect for every single account to have a single case created. So that's what we're doing in this section, line 47 to 51. And then we're doing another assert. So you'll see this is very common, like good test cases, good test methods have asserts, because that's how we know that what we expect to happen is actually happening. And that can apply to positive situations, like I expect for my code to behave like I expect it to behave. But it can also apply to negative situations as well. So sort of a good example of that, like Mark was saying, is if a validation gets hit, we can do some even fancier stuff to try to insert an account that would trip up a validation rule and then catch that validation rule back and make sure it's the right one. I actually have a link in the resources on how to do that. It's a little bit fancy. Sort of negative test case would be our scenario. If I try to insert an account,
Oh, Susannah, I think it's sounding like a robot again.
how's this? Any better?
Yes, much better.
Awesome. So for our negative test case, right, we can think through our requirement and say, okay, well, I want a new case for an Astra plushie to be sent out for any prospect account, but not for a technology partner account, for instance. So I can write this test that's going to say, you know, I created those 5 prospects in my test setup, but now I'm going to create an account that shouldn't actually trigger a case creation, and I'm going to insert that. And then again, go into my database and query it and say, hey, how many cases have been created? And in this case, in my negative test case, what I'm confirming is that this 6th case that I tried to trigger by inserting a non-prospect account actually did not get created. So this test is confirming that my code isn't creating cases or doing something where it shouldn't be. In this case, it's not creating a new case record for accounts that have type technology partner. And then moving on, so we have our positive, we have our negative. We've inserted what I would call single records, so like a small handful of records. We said, okay, well, we're testing for 5 accounts. That's, you know, like maybe someone on the front end entering 1 or 2 or 5 accounts. But another best practice is to always have a 4th test for your bulk insert. So in this case, we have a test case that is trying to insert 200 accounts. And this is, again, a best practice for testing bulk operations would be to try to insert 200 items. Blanca might go into some detail on why that's the case, but this is a good sort of bulk operation test. And a similar situation, we try to insert our bulk accounts, our 200 accounts that we've created, and then query the database and confirm that our bulk account insert has actually worked. So those are like the 4 prongs of the test that you can write and set up every single time you're writing code to make sure that your single inserts work, your bulk operations work, and sort of those both positive and negative operations. And just very quickly, I know we're running a little bit over. I do just want to walk through sort of a very quick example of like how you might actually write a little bit of code to pass your test classes. One thing that I didn't show you guys is, so we wrote this crazy looking test class, but the way you actually run your test is in the developer console is to go up to this test tab, and then there's many ways to do it. You could use this run button over here. I like to use this new run. It's a little bit fancier because you can actually select which tests you want to run. If you just wanted to run, you know, maybe just the bulk, you could choose that one. You can also choose to run your entire test suite if you want. But I'm going to go ahead and just select run all. And you'll actually see something kind of interesting, I think. You'll see that your test failed, first of all, which is good, right? So we know that we have these failures. And we also can see our sanity check test passed, which is not a surprise, but it's something to note because we know that this test isn't necessarily testing our code. It's just testing the fact that, yes, if I tell Salesforce to insert an account, it's going to do it, which for the most part is, again, just that like sanity check to make sure that there's nothing else weird going on outside the context of your particular code. But the way I would attack this then is to start working on and start saying, okay, well, these three failed. Let's start to write a very basic like code structure to see what we need to improve. And in this case, this is probably a preview of the rest of tonight again. I have this trigger that's listening for an event that happens in Salesforce. So in this case, the trigger is on our account object and it's listening for an insert operation. So it's listening for me to insert an account. And then it's in particular listening for what happens after. So this after an insert is going to do something. That's sort of what this trigger context variable is saying. And then in between the curly braces is the actual action that happens, the actual business logic that is going to happen. So to just sort of spoiler alert on this, what I'm going to say is if my trigger is in fact an insert, like I think it is, and my trigger is in fact after that insert, then I want something to happen. I want to do something with the records that were just created. And in this case, I want to pass all of the records that were created to my chunk of code that I'm going to write in my class on after insert. And I want to pass all of those new accounts in. And again, I know this is like really fast, but I'm essentially saying, okay, pass all of the new records that were created over to my class called account trigger handler. And in particular, pass them to this particular method, this particular chunk of code in my account trigger handler. So that is my like listener, essentially. It listens for this action and then passes over the records. And then what happens in my handler, it actually does something with those records that I just passed it. So essentially this is just saying, okay, I'm receiving those new accounts and now what? Now what is what happens on line 8. And the now what is that we want to, for every single account, right, that is inserted, we want to do something. So for every single account that is inserted in my new accounts list, we want to do something. We want to create a new case. And why not? Let's set a couple fields on the case, the required fields, so that we don't get an error there. I'll just put a couple of these. Subject and slushy. And then the important part is we want to make sure we associate it to our account that we are creating. And then finally, we're going to insert it. So we're going to insert our new case. I can go ahead and save this, do, and then our TDD, our test-driven development methodology say, right, I should write a little bit of code, write what I think might be the right solution, and then run our tests again. So I can flip back over here really very quickly. I can run our test suite that we developed again. And I can see right away that now instead of 3 failures, I have 2. So I can start to work, and this is really the magic of learning how to code and actually coding in real life is like working through, like getting a failure that you can do something with and knowing what to do next. So in this case, I can see that my case insert positive test worked. So my cases are getting created. That's awesome. But I can see that there's a couple of failures, and to take a look at them, I can open up that particular test and read sort of what that failure is telling me. So I can see that here I expected 5 cases to be created, but 6 cases were actually created. If I go back and just take a really quick peek at my method, I can see that, oh right, only prospect accounts were supposed to be created. So I can go in and start sort of like in real time, start to make some adjustments to my code. So I'm like, oh right, this should only happen when my type of account is prospect, because that was the requirement that was given to me, and that's the test that I sort of set out for myself. And we can start to do, again, bit by bit, improving and refactoring this code. Doing one of my favorite, Shift-Tab will reformat my code if I feel lazy and don't want to do it myself. And then the final test. So I have 20% code coverage now. I can take a look. Okay, I got another pass. Awesome. But I can see it's still failing. I have 1 failure left. I can see that all of my code was covered, but what's going on with bulk? What's this bulk error that I'm getting? I can go and look at my error. I can see that I'm getting a too many DML statements error, and oh yeah, I forgot that I need to make sure that I'm not hitting my governor limits of DML statements. So there's different patterns, right, that you guys will learn throughout, I'm sure, this class to avoid some of those limits. So I can go in there and maybe use one of those tools in my tool belt to fix that. In this case, I'm just going to do something quickly. Whoops, insert. I'm going to, instead of doing my DML in a for loop, I'm going to, what am I going to do? I'm going to add my new case that I created to a list inside my for loop. So this happens, I add this case 205 times or whatever it is. And then outside of my for loop, I actually, that's the end, right? Yeah. I actually insert all of those cases in one go so I don't get my error. And then, let's see. Finally, I can do my run one more time. Get my message, and then hopefully, let's see, did I do it right? Yes. So finally, I have all my tests running, my code passing, all of my test classes passing. And not only is it sort of meeting those bare minimum requirements, but I know that it's set up to withhold rate scale. So I'm not going to run into a situation where I have code that works when I test it on the front end, but if someone tries to insert 200 accounts, it breaks. One important point I glossed over is that the nice part about doing that bulk testing in instead of in the UI, right? You don't want to probably insert 200 accounts by hand or even by data load, because then you'd have to clean them up. With test code, when you're writing that @IsTest class and method, nothing is actually what's committed to the database, but then it's essentially rolled back. So those 200 accounts that we created don't persist. They don't clutter up your environment. they are just there for the duration of your test. So to recap, today we wrote a test method, we ran it, we wrote some code and ran our test again, and bit by bit, we improved our code to pass that test. We've got a ton of information, especially if you're just starting out, but there is a wonderful, wonderful Trailhead badge that was just actually released, I think, in the last month on the whole idea of testing and how to write both positive and negative tests. And also, you now know, if you didn't know before, sort of 4 basic tenets of writing good tests. Making sure that your tests are actually testing something. They're not just like that sanity check test we looked at that says like, yeah, if you tell Salesforce to insert an account, it's going to insert an account. You want your test to test your custom code. You can do that by using assert and saying, I expect this to happen. So let's actually look in the database and make sure that what I expect to happen did. And then, of course, writing tests for both like single operations, bulk operations, and then covering positive and negative scenarios. So that is, I think, my time. Thanks, Blanca.
Wow.
Anyway, I'm happy to
Thank you.
a lot.
And I just want to say that this was way thorough than I had ever anticipated. I knew your presentation was going to be really good, but having sat through this tonight, I just want to tell folks we're going to slow it down and talk about this a whole lot more. But thank you so much, Susannah, for joining us.
Of course.
See if anyone has any questions here. Mark joined us and he's in Chicago, so we have a few chats about how cold it is here. Does anyone have any questions they want to unmute their line for to ask Susannah before she closes out with us tonight? I think there's a question, how to deal with record type. Is it Paul?
That's a good question. So in our scenario, you know, if we were testing for a particular record type, we would want to include that, right? Either in our positive or negative. Like if our, excuse me, in a lot of orgs, right, your prospect account might be a different record type. So if that was the case, you could essentially first you would set up and query for your record type names, and then you could say, hey, only run this code if the record type is of this name. And that's sort of it's a great question. It's a little complicated question only because you guys probably already know that record types are referenced by ID a lot of the time. So if you're writing code and trying to fetch a record type, you need to do like an extra step in order to first get the names, like the labels essentially of your record type, and then you can reference the label, just because as a best practice, you don't want to hard code those IDs into your actual Apex code. It's a good question.
Yeah, and we haven't got there yet, but I'm sure we'll be covering it in the future with David's course. But thanks for asking, and thanks for answering, Susannah.
Of course.
Does anyone else have any last minute questions? No, I think we're good. Well, thank you, Susannah. Really, really, really appreciate it. I know you've been really, really busy, but we really, really want to send you a big hug from Chicago, from everywhere where all of us are from around the world. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Have a good class. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Let me switch back to our slides for tonight. So just to recap, because some of you joined us later, the session is being recorded. I hit record earlier on, and I will be sharing this in our Google Drive later. And because we had a special guest and we're covering more content tonight, we might even share this one out on the ArcLadies website. So I just want to take a quick pause. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, but today is Tuesday. For those of you who come from nonprofit fields like I do, it's a big day for fundraising for nonprofits all over the world. I will add that ArcLadies does have a .com, but the mission and the work that is being done, it's all volunteer led. There's no staff at Ladies Be Architects. Everyone's a volunteer. I myself, I volunteer, and everyone who joins us to present or hold study groups, they're people like you and me, everyday people trying to learn, trying to move forward, and wanting to help others and share the experience together. So if you haven't seen it already, there was a post on the Twitter feed for Ladies Be Architects, but they do have a fundraiser. I took this snapshot just before we started our session tonight, and it looks like we're very close to our goal. If you can see in here, there was a goal of $2,000, and we're up at about $1,457 right now. So while you're thinking about which organizations you like to support, I would say please consider making a donation. I will add that no donation is too little or too much. And you don't have to give right now. I mean, just participating and spreading the word, you know, sharing out a statement about the work that is being done by Ladies Be Architects and all of its volunteers, and just sharing a statement of what it means to you to be a participant in this study group or any of the study groups hosted by Ladies Be Architects. Spreading the word and creating awareness goes a long mile, and there's a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that we're getting more women interested in learning about Salesforce development and what is the journey like to CTA. So there is a link. It is going to be in the slide deck in case you want to look for it later. But because it is Giving Tuesday, I am in a giving thanks kind of mood. I have been since last week. So if you'd like to make a donation, that is ever more welcome. And then let's jump into our content for tonight. So the test-driven development session was great, and it does align with week 2 homework, which is actually, according to David Lewis, we're going to be learning how to write unit tests. It was advanced, so if for those of you that are new and have not been coding in Apex and for Salesforce, and this may seem overwhelming, but I will say it was a very thorough session, and you can always come back to the recording and rewatch it, and it will make sense the more we discuss these topics and move forward together. And Sunita has a question about a trigger before we start Apex. Yeah, why don't we hold it for 1 second, Sunita, if that's possible, because we are going to go over triggers in this part. So this is actually going to be a little bit more of a tester, because we did do week 1 homework. Some of you guys are rock stars and already did week 2, and some of you already did the extra credit, and that's great. However, we only technically had to do week 1 homework. So we're going to cover some ground right now that will just test our knowledge and what we should have learned up to this point with David's curriculum. So what is Apex? Feel free to unmute your line or type it in the chat box. When you hear the word Apex, what do you think of? Tim says Salesforce coding language. Yes. Melissa says a strongly typed language. And Mark says Apex and the limits. Yeah, we are going to talk about all of this tonight. And Suva says a programming language. Yeah, it is. So let's jump to this slide. As you already mentioned, it is a strongly typed object-oriented programming language, OOP for short. It is native to Salesforce, meaning that it is a coding programming language that's made specifically for the Salesforce platform. And a note that it compiles on the server and not on the local unit. When we say strongly typed, I think Susannah had already mentioned this in her session, and you might have already heard it in David Liu's Apex Academy segments that we've been watching for homework. But what does strongly typed mean? Similar to Java, but specific to Salesforce. Apex is. So for strongly typed, what we're talking about here is, sounds like we got a little bit of music there. Meaning that we have to specify what data types we're using when we're coding. We have to be very specific, and we need to make sure that we're, when we're coding, we're telling the system what types of data we're using. So that's, if you ever hear the term, that's what they mean by that. And Apex is stored in a series of instructions in metadata. And if you haven't heard about metadata, metadata is actually data about data. So we are going to learn a whole lot about our data in Salesforce and how to retrieve it and work with it and manipulate it. But metadata is the data about data. And Apex relies on methods, variables, classes to make the magic happen. So Susannah talked about and mentioned each one of these, and we will be learning about them as we go on. Variables, she mentioned, and we'll be talking about that in a second. And classes, we talked about that in our last week one. And then also, as Mark mentioned, Apex and the limits, and Susannah mentioned thinking about governor limits. That is definitely something that we need to be super mindful of and make sure that while we're coding and we're developing our logic, we're thinking about how to stay within the governor limits so that we will be friendly neighbors to those that are also using the Salesforce platform, because it is a multi-tenant platform. So let's cover what is syntax. And we talked about this briefly in week one, but what does syntax mean to you now that you've actually completed week one assignments? Anyone? What does syntax mean? Rules for the language. Yes, and Mary says it's like grammar for code. The actual language. Syntax is the grammar and punctuation you use for entering instructions. Mark and Sunita, yes. Structure, yeah. So let's think about, first, let's cover the definition according to Wikipedia. The syntax of a computer language is the set of rules that defines the combination of symbols that are considered to be correctly structured, document or fragment in the language. So you guys hit on it in your responses in the chat. You mentioned a lot of these words, structure and grammar and punctuations. So let's look at this slide that basically covers some of the basic Apex syntax that we should remember as we move forward. So in the code demo that Susannah did, she did have single quotes. And this slide will break down basically what it is and then why you use it. So single quotes are used to indicate a string of text. Semicolon is basically used kind of like when we write in English and we are writing a story or a paragraph or what it may be. After every sentence, we end with a period or sometimes an exclamation point, but it's kind of along the same lines. It's semicolon is used to define the end of a statement when you're coding. And we saw a lot of curly brackets. And the curly brackets are actually what defines the boundaries, or as David Liu mentioned in his Apex Academy segments, scope of a class. And we're going to be talking about what is scope some more. And it defines the boundaries of a class, method, or conditional statement blocks. And then parentheses. They're used to call a method and around criteria for looping, and we've learned about for loops, and conditional statements. Then we have the square brackets. So the square brackets are used around our SOCL query statements. And SOCL, you may have heard it. Basically, it's like SQL, it's the Salesforce Object Query Language. And that's why it's SOQL, SOCL. And it's used to define arrays. We talked about commas in our session 1, and there was 2 options. I mean, not commas, but comments, sorry. There's 2 options. We had the single line comment, which is here, the 2 slashes. And then we saw a lot, especially in Susannah's code demo, she used the multi-line comments. So you'd put this in the beginning, and then at the end of your multi-line comment, you would close it out. And then this is not an indent, but I put a little arrow so you know an indent. It's used to indicate code within scopes, and we'll talk about that. As Kelly Costa, who is actually doing David Liu's course being taught actually by him as part of VetForce, she spoke about how he really encourages all of the participants to adhere to very strict formatting of their code. And while it may be strict, it's strict for a reason, because it actually helps keep your code clean so that it's organized and easily able to be read by others and yourself. And it's a good way to stay organized, because there's a lot of code that goes into being a developer, and we're learning little by little. But any tips on formatting and syntax are more than welcome, and these are just one snapshot of a few of them. And Mark says Susannah's code was much prettier than his. Yes, hers is much prettier than mine too, but we can start these habits now. So we learn from example, and she was a great example, and so is David. So we will put a little bit more effort into it. So let's talk a little bit about Apex vocabulary. Some of these words you might have heard in Susannah's demo today, or you might have heard during the Apex Academy segments. So camel case, and I actually typed this out. You'll notice that camel has a small c here, and then case has a capital C. This is best practice for programmers, and oftentimes you'll see camel case used for naming. So when we start coding more and we have to name our classes and name our triggers, you'll see that camel case is often used. Also, variables. Can anyone tell me, and Susannah mentioned it tonight, and we had some in our homework, especially with Hello World, which was our first breaking the code habit, and we had a variable that was L in that assignment, right? So we declare variables in our code, and basically they're containers for our data. Variables are. And they're defined in the class, and in some cases, like we were developing triggers, and they're attributes of an object. Dot notation. Has anybody heard that term before? Dot notation. We saw it tonight. Yes, Sunita says a lot. Can you tell me a little bit about that, Sunita? Why do we use dot notation? Or anyone else, if you want to unmute and. Mark says, yes, very common in code, also use formula fields in Salesforce. Yeah, so
I think it's just to call the class methods existing in that methods, we can call them.
and Sunita added too, we can access the objects.
Right.
So remember, you guys are right. Salesforce is a relational database, right? So as part of us needing to think about the objects and our data and how objects relate to others and which fields we need to use when we're coding, dot notation is used so that we can make those connections, right? So we can code and tell the system we want to access this information from this object. And it looks like Mark added it's an easy way to access related items to what you're calling, either methods or properties. And then scope. I have brought this up, and I want to see if anyone picked it up from the homework assignments. Can anyone tell me what do we mean by scope? If we're talking about code, and he said, what scope is it part of? What do we mean by that? So let's see if I can pull up something right now. It means the visibility of an object bar in that area.
Like in case we are using loops and we are using variables within the loops, those variables are limited to that loop scope. I mean, that is the scope we have in that loop. Out of that loop, we can't use those fields.
Yeah, and Kim adds as well a group of code that works together. And Mark says a section of code. Yeah, so I'm sharing this notepad file where I have the code for the dedupe reminder trigger. And basically when we're talking about scope, what we're talking about is here we have a trigger and it's the dedupe reminder is the name of it, right? I mentioned indentations earlier and I mentioned it with relation to scopes. And basically here we have the for loop, right? And the for loop is indented because it's part of the scope for the dedupe reminder. And then if we look at this line of code here, these are actually part of the scope of what's inside the for loop, right? And specifically here, it's tied. So as you see, that's why it's indented here once, because all of this is part of this scope. And then you see another indent again, because this is a part of the scope of the for loop. So that's one of the terminologies that we should use. And then just be mindful about our coding as we move forward, how it is that we format, and how it is that we reference what we're seeing and what we're reading so that others can understand. So that's what we mean by scope. And then Mark added, indentation can be a touchy subject with experienced programmers. Do not ask a group of experienced programmers whether to indent with spaces or tabs. You will not enjoy the discussion. Yeah, so for us, because we're learning space or indent, whichever way you want. We just want to try to stay as organized as possible and keep things as neat as possible with our code, because it can get pretty messy and overwhelming to read. And the neater and more organized your code is, the easier it will be to read. And then last on this slide is trigger.new. Can anybody tell me what is trigger.new? Why do we use it?
Yeah, Blanca, I'll go over it, I think. I think in trigger.new, it's a list in which all the records on which the events are to be fired are stored.
Yeah, that's perfect, Sunita. Thank you so much. Yeah, and as Susannah mentioned, a list is one of 3 types of collections. So we will be learning about all of them. If you were in Platform Developer 1 study group, you might remember we have lists, we have sets, and we have maps. But trigger.new is definitely a list of all the records that are entering our trigger. And we'll talk some more about what do I mean by data, a lot of records that are moving into a list for us, right? We're going to talk about that tonight. So let's talk a little bit about triggers. I think, Sunita, you wanted to ask a question about triggers, right? So let's see if we can remember what exactly is a trigger. What makes code that's part of a trigger unique? Anyone want to take a wild guess? Or maybe you did your homework and you remember? Okay, so you might have heard Susannah mention that a trigger listens, right? It has its ear out and is always listening. A trigger is special code that is listening for something to happen. It's listening for something to happen as part of an object that you specify, and which action, what platform event is happening that it needs to listen for. But it's always listening to fire off the code. And a trigger outside of listening is also special because it has conditional logic to it, that we're saying, okay, listen for this action to happen on this object, and when that action happens, fire off, I want you to do this with whatever code you have written out. And we'll talk about this some more. And what triggers a trigger? Yeah, so
Statements.
what was that?
So is it DML statements?
Yeah, so like if you say, if a record is inserted or created or deleted, right? It's listening for that. Then you can do something. So, yeah. I'm just reading comments, and yes, all of these are part of a trigger, an event, an operation, conditional statements, or logics. And then what 2 areas in Salesforce can we use to create triggers? We've already used 2, one in our homework assignment, and then Susannah showed us another way today, and we did a brief demo last time. If we want to create a trigger in Salesforce, where do we go? Dev Console.
Dev Console, yeah.
That's one place. Where is the other place? Manage objects, and triggers. Yes, so we might get to it in different areas. I think in the example from David Liu, it was set up, customize, leads, and actually I'll just move over to the next slide because here are the answers. Here's the path to get to where you want to start a trigger within Salesforce. And then Developer Console is the built-in IDE for coding. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So what types of triggers, and you guys beat me to it. You guys are really good in the previous questions because it's already in the chat box. I won't tell you who said it, but what types of triggers do we have? Yes, before and after. So let's talk about what's the difference between them. So before triggers, these affect the data in the record before it is committed, which means permanently saved to the database. And after triggers, these use the data in the record after it is committed, meaning permanently saved to the database. And somebody mentioned record types, and Susannah talked about record IDs. So for instance here, if you see in this area, when we use the after trigger, it's used to access system values that are set by the system. For example, ID and last modified date. Oh, and Mark brings up a great term from Platform Developer 1 discussion we had about the term persisted. You will hear that. And so yes, here we have how it relates to coding. And then here, records that fire after triggers are read only. So these are some differences of the two different types of triggers for us to be mindful of. And what does David Liu say? Whenever in doubt, which one should we use? Before. Good job. It's a great job. Now, let's talk a little bit about what are the three types of inputs for a trigger. And this may not have been so clear, but it was in the Apex Academy segments. Do you remember what are three inputs? So he actually broke them down into name, the object, and the event. So that's the inputs that you need to create the trigger, right? It's kind of talking about how do you go about writing a trigger. So sorry, that question was a little bit tricky, guys. According to what I see coming in the chat box, I probably should have been a little bit more clear with this question, so my apologies on that. But yeah, these are the three things that we need when we're creating the trigger. Larry, Curly, and Mo, yes, and some coffee. So this slide I actually copied from our homework assignment. It's from the Apex Academy course, and I think it does a really good job in breaking down pros and cons of both types of triggers, before and after, and just kind of visually understanding which point is the record saved and when do you use which ones. So when do you use after, which is here on the right, and when do you use before. So that is helpful. Now let's talk about the trigger syntax. And this kind of relates with the previous question about the 3 inputs. But basically, we're stating a trigger, right? We're giving it a trigger name, and then we have to say on, and we have to give the object name in which we're creating the trigger on. And then we're going to tell it, these are the trigger events. And then within the curly braces, we say, this is the code you should run when the trigger fires. So for those of you that were part of the Ladies Be Architects Platform Developer 1, I have here in our source a link to where you can find more information about this. And I actually have this code snippet. It's from one of our study buddies, Kelsey Shannon, who is so awesome, and she covered part 2 of process automation, and she did intro to Apex and Visualforce. So that's where this came from. And if anybody would like to watch it, I would say when you have some time, I know that we have the mandatory homework and segments in Apex Academy we have to watch. These are great resources, and I put them in here for a reason, because if you do have additional time or you do want to later, even after this course, review the material and learn more, I would say check out this recording, because Kelsey did an amazing job for us, and it's a great resource. So here we have line 1, and here we have the same trigger. We're stating this is a trigger. The name of it is my account trigger. We're saying it's on the account object. You're listening for the trigger events before insert and before update. And then here is the open curly bracket. And then in line 2, this is a comment, right? It's a single line comment. And it says place your code here. And then we close it with the curly bracket. So one of the things that we want to be mindful of, and I think that David mentioned it in his course, that if you don't have curly brackets, your code statements should have semicolons. So that was just one of the little tidbits I wanted to make sure that we put in there, because we're starting off. There's so much to remember, and Lord knows that in the past I've sat down and tried to debug, and sometimes it's just a case of one missing semicolon that throws everything off, and then you have errors. So if you guys have tips like that, feel free to share them in our Slack workspace as well. Now let's talk a little bit about mindfulness when working on a multi-tenant environment. So Susannah had mentioned some of this already. And we know that the Salesforce platform is a multi-tenant environment, right? So we have governor limits. They still apply when we are writing Apex code. And some of the common types of limits per transaction that we need to remember are listed here. So 100 SOCO queries issued, 50,000 records retrieved from SOCO queries, 20 SOSO queries issued, and we haven't even talked about SOSO, but we will learn about it in the future. And then Susannah hit on this one tonight, 150 DML statements. And then there's another limit that's on CPU time, and that's here, the 10,000 millisecond CPU time. And then in our homework assignments, that's one of the reasons why we were talking about when we write our code, we should try to bulkify. And here it's talking about, think about batches of 200 because you don't want to hit any governor limits So you want to be mindful of that. And then part 2. So part 2 of what to be mindful of, and this applies to a lot of this. Susannah probably touched on already some of these bullet points more extensively than others, but they're all very important. So when we are writing Apex, we know that we have to have, as David would call it, companion code. So we need code test coverage of at least 75% or more. For those of you that were in the Platform Developer 1, what percentage do we want to aim for when we're seeking test coverage? We know 75 is the minimum, but what should we aim to be getting with test coverage?
100%.
100%. Is it achievable? Yes. All the time? Maybe not. But we want to try to get as close to 100 as we can. The reason being, and we're going to learn more about this as we write test classes and we talk about unit testing. Sometimes you may have, let's say, exactly 75 test coverage in your sandbox. Then let's say you go to deploy it and then it doesn't go through because for whatever reasons, maybe you lost a percent of test coverage. And so then you can't deploy it. So you never want to settle for the 75. That's just the minimum, but we always want to strive for more. And it may be that some of your classes might have more test coverage than others. And we'll learn about which lines of code are not included in test coverage. We're going to learn about those, like comments. Some other things you need to be mindful of. All assertions must pass. So Susannah mentioned the assert, system.assert, and we learned about that for those of us that were in Platform Developer 1. Whenever you have test classes, unit tests, you need to have test assertions. Your tests are not completely done if you do not have assertions, and they must pass. All test classes must pass before deploying from sandbox to production. And then another thing, as we're learning about triggers, you should only have one. Not 10, not 3, not 100, just one. Should only have one trigger per object, okay? This sometimes, if you are new to programming, you may not have known that. We learn something new every day. So the good general rule of thumb is only have one trigger per Salesforce object. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about test classes. And some of this Susannah already tackled for us. But test classes is code that tests our code. It's testing to make sure that our code is doing what we intended it to do, right? Because sometimes we're learning, we can make mistakes. And sometimes, even for developers that have been doing this for many years, sometimes we overlook something and we make a mistake. And basically, you just want to make sure that your test is actually a way of checking to make sure that your code is doing what it needed to do. And as David mentioned, think about tests as our companion code, right? You have your code, you have your triggers, you have your logic within your triggers, but tests are the companion code. You need them both. And as Susannah mentioned, with the whole test-driven methodology, it's basically some people will code. I mean, some people will write out their test before they start their code. We're learning the reverse because there's a lot to learn. We need to understand how to code, to understand how to test. But some people get the test done first, and then they start writing their code. For us, we'll stick to learning how to code and then writing our tests. Although, yes, for those of you that have already completed Rad Women, writing test classes and handlers was part of the last part of what we learned, and it was a little bit crammed, but it's something that we will use a lot. We will always create tests, and as David said, we're going to learn how to love test classes. And basically test classes can help us, right? Because as David Liu mentioned in the exercises, if we don't have test classes, then we have to manually figure out how to test our code to make sure it's doing what we want it to do. And we're humans, we make mistakes, right? Or sometimes it takes us much longer than it does a computer. And a computer is way more efficient. So why not have the system run the test classes? It'll save us some time in having to create records to test. We were forcing the triggers to execute and verifying results. These are all parts of how we would manually go about testing. And we're going to talk about this with the test data, which we mentioned tonight, but we will learn what it is exactly we can use and what we need to create. And here, yeah, we'll learn how to love writing tests. We will be good tenants on the multi-tenant Salesforce platform. And we need the assertions to verify our test results. There is a lot more to learn about the @is test, the test setup. There are pieces, we probably saw a whole lot more in Susannah's presentation tonight. And it's good to kind of see a walkthrough very thorough of everything. And then as we move on, piece things together. As we learn more, go back to this recording, go back to the Apex Academy sessions on Pluralsight, and just kind of keep helping reemphasize some of these main points of learning that we need to catch on to, and make connections, because it takes time. It takes a lot of time. 16 weeks for this course. I did 10 weeks before with Rad Women, and that's not enough time. This is going to be an ongoing thing for us, and we'll come back to resources multiple times. You may have to read or watch or listen or code and then try again and refactor and break things and then come back and code again and fix it. It's a learning curve. So I say it with a smile, but we will have to have a lot of patience and we will persevere together, okay? So we will be learning more about tests. Does anyone have any questions from homework assignment number 1? I know that I've mentioned we will learn about posting on GitHub. So we will cover that for a few minutes today. But if anybody had either a question or an aha moment, maybe there was one point in your assignment with Apex Academy, or even the extra credit assignment, one point that stuck out like a sore thumb. Maybe you were stuck and then you got over the hump and you figured something out. I mean, any questions or feedback or sharing your learning experiences is more than welcomed here. And feel free.
Hi, Blanca. Sunita here.
Hi, Sunita.
Yeah. So I want to share my experience on, and it can be I resolved it later on, but I still have the question. So I can go over my experience on did you account homework? So while I tried the trigger and I used the user ID I got from the URL by navigating to the user account in the Lightning, and it gave me 17 characters, but I was expecting it to be either 15 or 18. And I put that in the trigger, and the trigger did not throw any error upon saving. And however, when I tried to create a new account, it gave me a exception that's I think it was invalid ID exception. And then I Googled a bit and went through Salesforce communities and tried to get why it's giving me 17 characters. It should give me 15 or 18. So then I tried to, I didn't get any answer, but I got to know why we are using 15 or 18. And then I I switched to the classic, and I got the user ID from the URL, from that URL. And it gave me 15 characters that time. And it worked out well. So I could able to create that trigger without any error. Also, it didn't give me any error and create a new account for me. So the resolution was to switching on to classic and getting the ID from there. But why still the mystery remains the same in my head. Why it gave me 17 characters? It should have given me 15 or 18. And one more is how classic gave me 15 correct ID. So
yeah, that is a great question. And honestly, I haven't encountered having a 17-digit record ID.
yeah, that was
If anybody has encountered that before, inquiring minds want to know, because I will stay puzzled.
yes. So even I was expecting 18 in Lightning, so it gave me 17. I counted, and even I came up with I googled a website which counts the digits, and I was making sure whether my counting is correct or not. So it was 17 every time. I was really amazed why. Not amazed, it's puzzled. So
Yeah, I mean, maybe, I don't know. I don't see any chats about anyone else encountering the 17 record. And Mark added it should have returned 18 for Lightning. So maybe we won't know the answer to why we got 17 on that.
right, yeah.
But I think there's a great...
It might have returned 18, but I've seen it occasionally on like the URL when you just try to double click, it doesn't somehow select the whole ID.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like it selects the whole ID, but it's ended up missing like one letter or one piece of it.
It was, I verified it multiple times. So I selected the user ID between those two percentage signs. So it was 17. So I don't know what was going on there.
I think what's very cool, Sunita, is that in this sharing your story, you found a way to resolve the problem, right? You switched to classic and you were able to get the 15-digit. But you also mentioned you Googled, you went to the success community.
Yes.
And these are all excellent pieces to how we learn, right? Because I'm not an expert. I don't think you are experts. I mean, maybe, you know more, but we're all here learning, right? There's so much to learn, and things change all the time. So I think knowing which resources to go to and try to find answers is awesome. And I do appreciate you. I know that was a struggle, and I know how I am. Sometimes I can't sleep at night. I'm thinking about why, what's going on? What is wrong? But you know what? I think this is a great story. And thank you for sharing that, Sunita.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, that's excellent. Did anyone else have any pain points they wanted to share or questions? I see we have a question about homework and where we can find it. And I can definitely show you where to find things. So here we have the Ladies Be Architects Apex 16 Study Group Google Drive. And in this Google Drive, all of the resources that we are creating or that we have as tools to help us are saved in here. So for instance, if I go in here to week 2, you see here is the presentation that I'm using tonight. And in our presentations, I always have a slide that has homework. And you can always find your homework here. When in doubt, you can always come back to this main Apex 16 study group folder. And I actually downloaded, I think it's this one here. Yes, when I hover over it, it says Salesforce Development Curriculum. This is actually David Liu's document that he has on his website. I just downloaded and dropped it in our drive. But this is readily available for anyone.
This was very helpful for me, this specific document here.
Mm-hmm. So this is exactly what we're following. So for week 0, we have this homework assignment, right? And then for week 1, which is our last session, this was our homework assignment. And then he also gave us optional reading. Optional reading, I would say, if you have time, try to read every week, whatever we have in here. Sometimes, some weeks, life may get a little bit hectic. I know last week was craziness for me and my family, so I didn't have enough time to read everything, but you can always come back to it later as well. But whenever you can, try to cover as much as you can, but I would say take it with a grain of salt if you don't get around to everything every single week. We want to try to stick to this, but I think that it's also important to understand that sometimes we get stuck. And when we get stuck, sometimes it's best to save where we got stuck so that we can talk about it together on our live sessions. So yes. And then, yeah, these are just other tools that we have. I think there's some more questions. Let me just check the chat box. Yeah, Mark made a good point that some of this reading is phone friendly, so you can read it while you're sitting on the train or waiting for something. And then for the plural site, I would say it is a lot in one space. And I don't know, Mark, maybe you can answer this if this is what you're meaning in your comment, but do the links take you directly to each little segment? I think it's really just the course, right? Does anyone?
They don't take you straight to the segment, I don't think, but there's several different courses in here that they take you to.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of them are like 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and it runs pretty fast. You know, even in your cooking, you can just switch on your phone and listen to it. So that's very helpful. It's pretty quick. You don't have to sit down and listen. You can just listen while you do your other work. It's helpful.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Sometimes you can listen and then maybe you have time to watch the pieces that are actually walking through the code. because I think it's helpful as we're learning to like visually see it and follow exactly what he's doing. But do what makes sense for you. If it makes sense for you to watch it first and then listen again or read, or, you know, find a routine that makes things work for you. Every one of us learns very differently. And there's no right and wrong way to learning. You know, and we will try one way, and if that week it doesn't work, we'll try another way. So just hang in there. Okay, so that is the Google Drive. While we're on this, does anyone not have access to Google Drive? If you don't, send me an email, please, just to let me know you don't have access to this. But I know I sent a few rounds trying to get those that were missing it, and I think I caught everybody, but let me know if you don't. I know that 2 people have reached out and there was a problem with the Pluralsight code. I haven't heard back, but I will send out another code. We'll try it, and if that doesn't work, I'll try to see if I can figure out some way how we can go about this. One of the things too, does anyone have any questions about the homework assignments? Okay, let's very quickly go through what I was talking about, and I think that Mary has done an excellent job already in how we want to go about sharing our code, because week 1 was very low level code, meaning that it wasn't very lengthy, it wasn't very complicated to follow, and for week 1 it was perfectly fine if you copied and pasted into the Slack workspace. From now moving forward, because we're getting into more developed code and it will get longer and longer and multiple pieces as we move forward, we're going to use GIST, G-I-S-T, part of GitHub, and we will use that. In our Google Drive, there is a document here, how to share code in GIST. And here is the document. When you open it, it just walks you through, and this is exactly what Rad Women Code used when I was learning. It goes through how do you create a GIST account, how do you set up your code in GIST. So basically it's an online platform where you can copy your code into so that you can share. And the way that we do it, for the sake of learning, we choose to make it private so that only the people who you are sharing the link with can see your code. Meaning that if those of you that have heard about GitHub, and I think Microsoft bought GitHub and people were worried about what's going to happen to all their code, it's a place where people publicly share their code. A lot of the code that you will see for the Salesforce platform is shared out. And because we're learning, I will ask for folks not to share publicly, only because sometimes there's people that have been coding for a good amount of time and take it very serious, and sometimes they're very over analytic about how they critique others' code, and we just don't want someone to encounter a person who maybe had good intentions but came off wrong in their comments on your code. So basically, it's a way to just protect our code and keep it a little bit more shared in an intimate group, our group, so that others are not discouraging us in any way. Because honestly, we're going to make mistakes. Honestly, our code is not going to be the cleanest right away. I mean, really, if it makes sense, that's awesome, but sometimes it's not going to make sense. It's a learning curve. We take baby steps to it, And, you know, it's a way of learning how to code. And it's not always going to be pretty. It's not always going to be nice. And then when it works and it's doing exactly what you're doing and you have the test coverage you have, then you're going to be so excited and you'll share it with the world. And that's great when you get to that point. Right now, we'll just share privately. So this walks you through how to go ahead and share your code. You copy and paste it. I think I had this pulled up. Let me just double check. I thought I opened up a tab. I don't think I have it up here. Okay, for time's sake, I'm not gonna walk this through, but look at this document. What you will do then is you will use the link and share the link in the Slack workspace. And then we'll go from there. One thing I do want to mention that I think is pretty funny, because we do need to stay humorous and smiling and laughing as we learn, because coding can be very complicated, and I think we just have to find ways to amuse ourselves as we move forward. So one of the things that I want to share is actually this blog post by Stephen here, and it's the 7 deadly sins of the force.com developer. And what I like about this, you'll see many variations of this if you Google it, but there's actually memes, and these memes are hilarious. So take some time to read this. It'll help us reinforce what we should not be doing. And then there's these funny memes. So you make me a sad panda when we do things wrong. But it's pretty funny, this site. So I will put this in our resource area, and you can check it out on your own time. Talking about resources, I do want to cover one thing, because last week I went and updated our resources. And it looks like others have too. Oh, I love this. Everyone's contributing. So in the Google Drive, there's this sheet. You can add resources as we go along. Here I added a few. So here is a Get Started with Apex for admins. And I believe this is, it's just a resource that's on YouTube. And here it covers the basics of Apex. Susannah, she did a really good introduction to Apex study group. I forget which month it was. It was early in the year for ARC ladies. And here is the link to the recording. So you can watch it when you have time. So a lot of these are just additional resources for you, and everybody can add in to this document. It doesn't have to just be me. If you find a resource that you found has helped you on this journey, feel free to share it with us, because it saves everyone time.
Actually, it was me who added from 8 to 18, I think so. This is mainly Apex Workshop Webinar 1, which is from New York City user group, who has developed this series, which has 12. You can go through with all that videos, and then it's very helpful.
That is amazing. And I will add that I love videos. For me, I need to hear it. I need to see it. I need to hands-on code doing it. So any and all ways of learning is welcome. So thank you, Hema.
No problem, anytime.
So we're coming up on 9:30. Does anyone have any questions? We know what our homework is. So we have writing test classes as part of our homework. And then we'll provide feedback. So I think now that we're going to be coding either one assignment or maybe a few code snippets for different assignments every week, we'll have more conversations. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Slack workspace. Let us know. I mean, we're here, and I'm going to be better about trying to carve out time during the day to look at the Slack workspace to see what we have going on there. And then use the time too for live sessions. If anybody wants to volunteer to demo their code for next week's session, shoot me an email or send me a message on Slack and let me know. I mean, I'm more than happy and want this to be as interactive as possible. And we all learn in different ways, and we all have something to share. An optional reading, there's only one for us this week, How to Write a Test Class. Although, if you find other things, feel free to read other things or look at what's in the resources document. But let me know how you're doing and if you have any questions. We have a few minutes left tonight.
I do have one question, Blanca.
Yeah.
In the document where it says how to upload your code in GIST, the last point where it says take the URL and put it in the Slack workspace.
Yes.
Where should we put it? I mean,
yeah, that is a great idea. And let me switch over to Slack. I hope I can open it now. Okay. So does anybody have Slack up that can share the screen? Because somehow I need to figure out why I'm locked out on mine.
I have it open.
Okay, so let me stop sharing my screen, and then you can share your screen, and I will walk you through where we would put it. I think you can share your screen now, Suba.
Yeah. Okay. Here. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Okay.
Oh, there it goes. It's just a little slow, but it's loading. It's trying.
Hopefully my power doesn't go down. My charger is running out of charge. Come on.
I think it's still great. So we have the LBA Apex 16.
Oh, I have it. Is that,
Yeah.
Can you see that? Okay, good.
Yeah, so this is great. Oh, how come you don't have it?
I don't.
If you click on channels.
Yeah, you're in
And
general, right?
Click above where you are, where the word channels. Click on that for me.
Okay.
And then these are all the channels that we have, but you should be in the LBA Apex 16. You just scrolled past it, up a little bit more. Click on that. And then join at the bottom.
Oh, but what is this then, Apex Avengers?
Oh, that might be your team or your group.
Yeah, that's our team.
Okay, good.
East Coast team.
So this is great, and I'm sorry guys, because I'm also a newbie to Slack, and I didn't realize it's this complicated on your end. So one of the reasons why we didn't just use the Slack workspace from Platform Developer 1 was because we had additional channels, and I know with this group we're going to have our own channels. So the channels are like different chat rooms, if it makes sense, that falls within our Ladies Be Architects Apex 16 workspace. So you can switch from different channels and join conversations based on the topic area for that channel. So Mary, I'm so glad you're
Sure.
walk us through this. So great. Thank you.
No problem. I think of channels like a file, like your group is the file cabinet and your channels are the drawers in your file cabinet. So each drawer is kind of a repository for a certain conversation. So your team stuff will be in Apex Avengers, and general stuff will be in general, and homework will be in the LBA Apex. I know Mark's also a very heavy Slack user. I'm always happy to answer questions if you want to message me. I have my Twitter handle also in my Slack name, so we use it at work all day long, so I'm happy to help people if they need a tip or two.
Yeah, that is awesome. Thank you so much for offering, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Sure.
Okay, do we have any other questions before we wrap for tonight? All right, so have fun with writing some test classes, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you, Blanca.
Thank you, Blanca. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Blanca. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all.